Morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time of day you see this. I have a presentation for you, and welcome to students at Nipissing University. Tanseakwa, Heather Blair and Sigasun, Lanigan, Saskatchewan, Ochinia. I'm also currently, I teach at the University of Alberta. A Blackfoot elder who I've worked with quite a few years has said this, and I'd just like to start with, language is the essence of our being, of who we are. It is the defense against assimilation. If we lose our language, we're truly lost. You've been reading about a multilingual Canada, and Cummins and Prasad's article very clearly articulates the policies and point out the myths of the Canadian myths that we are a diverse society living in intercultural harmony. Excuse me if I need a drink of water here and there. They also remind us about the lack of formal policies to support the realities for multilingual Canadians. New Canadian multiple realities are overlooked in this country, but I contend that Indigenous people and their languages are even further off the radar. Now, this is a very dense slide, but you'll have the PowerPoint later. You can go back and look at it. Our federal languages don't begin to address Indigenous language needs, and the lack of a policy is kind of a de facto policy. Having no policy is a policy, in fact. The AFN suggests that the official bilingualism policies in Canada really are a kind of linguistic genocide through neglect. Now, many provinces and some school jurisdictions will have no explicit policy. Some have recommendations, but no policy with any teeth. The territories, are the exception in regard to languages. And the Northwest Territory passed an Official Languages Act in 1988 with 18 official languages, and the Yukon also has the Languages Act, but it didn't actually designate them as official languages. So that kind of status really does make a difference, because if you're an official language, then something official needs to be done about it. More than 40 years ago, the National Indian Brotherhood, which it was then called the National Indian Brotherhood, wrote a policy paper called Indian Control of Indian Education. And this policy paper is really still, in my mind, a very, very important document. And it recognized the need for Indigenous languages, or what at that time they would have called native languages, and formal instruction of native languages. You probably know that because of the Indian Act, First Nations and Inuit people are the jurisdiction of the federal government in Canada, and Métis are the responsibility of the provinces. So children, First Nations children, fall under the jurisdiction of federal schools, which are today banned schools funded by the federal government, and Métis students go to provincial schools and urban schools. Each band can have their own policy for their community and the reserve school regarding languages, but remarkably few do. These policies are established by what's called a BCR, or a Band Council resolution. In your area, if you're in close proximity to a First Nations community and you work with teachers there, it would be something that's certainly worth asking. Because even though some band councils have BCRs, they're not always enacted on an ongoing basis. Sometimes they are let lapse in a kind of way. But policy alone is not enough if these languages are going to be saved. There are curriculum frameworks in all of the provinces, but these are for core language programs, which you're very familiar with. From an Indigenous rights perspective, Indigenous Canadians have made a very conscious choice not to be bundled into the category of heritage languages, and I know you're talking a great deal about heritage languages, but because of Indigenous people feeling they have an inherent right that's distinctly different from newer Canadians, that they didn't want to see themselves bundled in that, and some of it's for legal reasons. Also, they felt it would be a watering down of what their issues and needs are. Excuse me. These languages are precious for the people who speak them and for the rest of us. The late Ken Hale worked diligently on Indigenous languages, and he said, losing any one of them is like dropping a bomb on the Louvre. James Crawford, another very well-known scholar, noted, language death seldom occurs in communities of wealth and privilege, but rather to the dispossessed and disempowered. Indigenous people are one of the most dispossessed and disempowered of all contemporary groups, so it is little wonder then that much of their linguistic and cultural heritage has already been extinguished or is facing extinction. Now that is a very shocking and very thought-provoking comment. Who are the people whose languages are being lost? Not the rich, not the famous. There's a very good website on endangered languages, the UNESCO website, and I've posted it here for your further reference. Just a little bit about the background and the significance and the amount of loss. World languages are dying. 90 of them are expected to disappear in the next 100 years. Canada's Aboriginal languages, there are 50 of them currently, approximately, belonging to 11 major language families. And there are isolates, too, small languages that don't have any other family members. And there are dialects within each language. So that there's no exact number on how many we have. Practically none of the endangered languages are spoken by children at home. So if children aren't speaking them at home, what's going to happen by the next generation? Likely they will be extinguished. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People made recommendations for Indigenous languages, and one of that is the importance, and we'll come back to this later in another slide, of intergenerational language transmission, and that children are learning language as a mother tongue. They're learning it first. Just a little bit of further background. Saskatchewan has, back in the late 1980s, did a very important little research study that showed the kinds of loss in Saskatchewan at the time. And they have since gone back to revisit that and have shown continued deterioration of the Indigenous languages of that province. In most communities, there's a range of speakers from people who speak only English to some bilingual, but each year there are fewer and fewer speakers. The speakers of Indigenous languages in Canada is an aging population, so they tend to be people 50 years plus. Indigenous communities are looking for effective language programs, and they're trying to do new kinds of programming, some dual language programming, some immersion programming in little pockets of places, and they're looking for expertise, and they look to places like the Maori immersion program in New Zealand with their kohangareos that start with preschool language nests and move on now all the way through schools and to university in New Zealand, where the students are being taught in Maori. Just like if you were wanting to become a bilingual, a French specialist, you could do your, you would likely have gone through immersion in Canada and could do university preparation in French. In Arizona, there's a dual language program, Navajo English at Rough Rock, the Mohawk immersion programs in Quebec and Ontario, or other places that people look to for success stories. There's not one size fits all. Each program needs to be tailored depending on the context. And as a reminder, and I'm sure you know this because you work in second language, in the second language field, the reacquisition of an Indigenous language is a new field, and we look to second language acquisition, second language theory, second language teaching and methods for ideas for good programming. You read our article, Billy Joe Lobocon and my article on language loss in Alberta, and we used Joshua Fishman's Graded Intergenerational Disruptive Scale, I'll just call it GIDS after that, that talks about leveling languages. By leveling, I mean categorizing people at stages of loss, and that the higher number on the scale, the language is at most danger, and the lower number on the scale, it's healthiest and safest. According to this scale, the Indigenous languages in Alberta would be mostly at 6 and 7, and perhaps some that might be 5. Stage 8, which you've read, very few remaining speakers of the minority language. Stage 7, it's used by older, as I said, the 50 plus group, not the younger generation. And stage 6, where there's just minimal language being passed on in the community, but not that much. According to our sources, Billy Joe and I, there are no communities that would be healthier than stage 6, and that's likely not even a reality. So just by contrast, stage 3. In stage 3, the Indigenous language would be used in the work areas, in the school, in the band office. There would be employment for bilingual workers. When you work at your desk in the band office, you'd be expected to answer phones in Cree as well as English. In the school, you'd be expected to be using both languages, and there would be support for each individual's bilingual language development, Indigenous language in particular. A map of Canada, and including Indigenous languages. Now I know it's very small and it's not that helpful, but there's not that many languages to be found, and you might want to come back to this later, and they're described more in linguistic and family terms. This chart from UNESCO is a way I find that's very helpful for communities to look at where are we at in our own language health state. And on the top left, these are the kinds of things people need to determine. And again, we'll come back to this in a little bit more detail, but how many people in our community actually speak our language? And what is the proportion of speakers to the size of our community? Now, those things are not easy to ascertain, and it takes very astute kind of sociolinguistic research, as they had done in Saskatchewan, I referred to earlier, and will be in your reference sheet, the sociolinguistic study of Indigenous languages in Saskatchewan. Looking at these kinds of things are really important, because until we know what we have as this linguistic resource, we can't really plan for what we want. So what do we have? What do we want? What are our long-term goals? Again, on this left-hand side, we see sussing out what are the kinds of resources available. Up at the very top of this slide, above the language vitality in red, is the term intergenerational language transmission, and we will come back to that. But it's exactly what it says, that the language is being used across generations. And the more generations, the better, obviously. Next down on the right is community members' attitudes. How do people value their language? Do they have a positive attitude towards their own language? And in the case of Indigenous people, and because of the legacy of residential schools, there is a lot of fear and negative ideas about Indigenous languages and in the minds of Indigenous people. it's a very delicate subject. It's a very delicate thing. But I have found for the most part, people want their language. Continuing around this chart, where is it currently used? These are the kinds of things you need to look at if you're looking at the vitality of a language. What are the domains where it's used? Is it only used in church ceremonies? Is it used in preschool? Is it used in the band office? And what are the governing agencies around that encircle, could we say, this language? The other language policies, such as our federal language policy, provincial language policies, school board language policies, and again, in each context, it will be different. Band control schools, it's different, obviously, from provincial schools, but all of those things need to be looked at. What kind of documentation is available on the Anishinaabe language? What's there? What do we know about the language? And how are the new medias either being used or potentially could be used for your Cree Anishinaabe programs? Excuse me, got it. Orientations is a term I'd like to introduce you to. And Richard Ruiz is a scholar at the University of Arizona who does some very interesting work with minority languages. And he frames how that if language, that these orientations to language really make a difference and they position us in different ways. Now, we have seen language as a problem over generations. Indigenous languages were viewed as a problem. The sooner the children get rid of these languages, the sooner we'll be able to move them along with English, and the sooner they'll do better in school and be better integrated into Canadian society. That can be said for other languages in this country as well: Ukrainian, Polish, any number. Sadly, I'm a past ESL teacher as well, so and I know that as much as I know the importance of teaching English as a second language, I do know that it can have a bit of let's just do English, that other language is getting in the way, let's leave it behind. So we need to be thoughtful about that as ESL teachers. The language as a right orientation represents a more legal, moral, natural right, like the argument the French have made in this country over many years. It's a part of our identity, who we are, and we have a right to it. There are Indigenous people who have that orientation, that we have a right to our language, and that's not a bad orientation to your language, but Richard Ruiz would suggest that a better way to perceive languages in relation to each other is view the Indigenous language or the language as a resource. So there are ideas, there are things embedded, there are knowledges in this resource, and there's a value in this resource, almost like a commodity, although I know Richard hesitates to use the term commodity. But let's say we're running out of timber in Alberta, and there's lots of timber in Montana. So Montana's timber is a resource to us, and vice versa. Our timber is a resource to them. Well, in fact, all Indigenous languages of Canada border some international, all the language families have a relative in some international country. And when the Cree language resource is drying up in Montana, they very well may come to Alberta or Saskatchewan to where the resource could be stronger. And so we need to, that's one way of looking at resources. Another way of looking at language as a resource is that inherent in this language are knowledges that might not be found in other language systems. Let's say that the cure for cancer is in a Blackfoot medicine medicinal plant, and we lose that access to language, we lose access to a cure for cancer. So that's just another way to have you think about language as a resource. I just can't overemphasize the urgency for this re-examination, rethinking, developing policy, and policy with some meat to its matter, to provide for the conservation, management, and development of these precious natural resources. And like any natural resource, we need to pay attention. Foundational principles, and Joshua Fishman is the person who came up with the GID scale. He also has some very key ideas for us, and 3 things, and he has researched Indigenous languages worldwide, small languages worldwide, and he said there are 3 things that need to take place if this, whatever the language revitalization work is if it's to be successful. There are 3 things. 1, intergenerational links. As I said earlier, language is being spoken between generations. Then that's habitual. It's not once in a while. It's on a regular daily basis. Ideological clarification, that people talk about and get out in the open how we value, what we believe about this language. And we need to, the community needs to come to some kind of agreement on this and get it out in goal statements and in belief statements, because there are going to be tough times and tough decisions to be made. So we need to be very clear on what we believe and how we hold our language. And I did some research with my undergrads, my First Nations undergrads, a few years ago, and around this, and I'm just very interested in this notion of ideological clarification. The third, this is where the hard work comes in, the participation of people who really care and are dedicated and are willing to do the hard work. And as you know, language education, minority language education is hard work, and in Indigenous languages it's even harder because there's more of it to be done. I put this slide in here of some intergenerational language going on at a summer camp that I work as a part of at the University of Alberta, and I'd like to recognize my colleague and friend Ferlin McGilvery there in the background with the braids. So to go along with policy, we need a plan. And each community and school plan will depend on the health of the language in that community and surrounding communities. And the policy and programs that flow from that kind of needs assessment needs to be based specifically on the local context. This is a model of language planning that Richard Ruiz uses. It actually is also attributed to Joshua Fishman and E. Hagen. So if you're interested in the field of language planning. And on this we have, on the left-hand side, we have the status of language. And this is just what we've been talking about, what some would call, or Richard would call, the matters of the nation. What is the policy? What is the social linguistic status? Is this language healthy or not? Here are some questions on this side that I use when working with my adult students who are teachers and going back to their schools after our summer program. What is the health of your language? How can you find this out? What are the goals in your community? Short term, long term? What policies are there now? Are they appropriate? How is this policy to be implemented? And how is it impacted by other policies? So there's lots of questions around that status of language that need to be squarely addressed. On the right-hand side, we have corpus planning, and corpus is like your the body of the language. So think of the muscles of the language as being the corpus. So you're very fit, you're athletic, you've got big, strong muscles in your arms and your legs. Well, that's what languages have. However, when languages are in the process of obsolescing, they're losing their muscular strength. They're shrinking. Their muscles aren't as strong as they used to be. They don't have the power to do some of the things they used to do. And this is the case with many Indigenous languages. And this is the case where that gym work, shall we say, needs to be done. The rebuilding. So is there a writing system? Can you write your language? If not, then we need to start to write your language. And by we, I mean the community needs to start to write the language. Do you know the rules of how your language works? Most people know their own grammar. You have your mother tongue grammar in your head, but it's hard to teach it if it's not kind of agreed upon. And do you have recorded speech? Do you have some samples of really rich language? Is it stored and is it safe? I was in a First Nations community not that long ago, and in their library they have a small section in the back of the library that is all these wonderful video and audio tapes of elders done over the last 40 years, but they're sitting on shelves. They're not being digitized. They may not be there for the next generation, but there's a rich resource there to be protected. And things like dictionaries and phrase books, children's storybooks, the things we take for granted in French and English education, and even to some degree in Mandarin and other heritage languages. But we can't take them for granted because they just don't exist in any great there's no body of it. So lots of things to think about. Elaboration. What do you do about the new words? I mean, we all invent new terminologies all the time. How is that being done in languages? Languages need to remain current. They have to move along with the times, as do we all. And I better get moving along here. Then number 4 is the implementation. That's more the kinds of things that you and I are involved with. Preschool, school, community, teacher development. We have a community linguist training program here at the University of Alberta. We do courses for people who are language teachers in their schools. They may not be teachers, they're instructors. They may not have a B.Ed degree. Some do, but to take courses that specifically prepare them for second language teaching, curriculum and materials in Indigenous language context, assessment of Indigenous language programs. So any community plan needs to look at all of these kinds of things, and what curriculum there is, and local materials. And then at the end there needs to be kind of a circular, I should have an arrow that comes all the way back around from evaluation back up to status of planning. And because there's a lot of things in this loop. Just a few points that came from my students that when I asked them, what do you lose when you lose your language, that I think is was very powerful for me. Self-identity, knowing who you are, a way of expressing ideas, abstract ideals. Ideas, I believe that is actually. Things like hope, love, honesty, truth. Ideals, they are as well. A way to convey ideals, a sense of spiritual beliefs. Ability for culture to evolve diminishes with language loss. So they don't want culture to be lost, and language is central to that. A connection to humor, a part of yourself. Lose meaning with your true intent. Lose connection to your family. If you lose our language, we lose morals, values, understandings to cultural teachings, expressions, and special ways of doing things. Details about the natural environment, access to what we might call cultural capital. I'm just going to leave you with this little quote. I'm not going to read through it, but Marie Baptiste and Miss Willett have done some very good work. And I'm running out of time, so that's work to be done. The most important goal for Indigenous language policy is to preserve, protect, and promote these languages. Otherwise, nothing can be assured. As language as a resource, let's make that our productive stance to move forward. We are all treaty people, and as non-Indigenous Canadians, we too signed those same treaties. So we are all treaty people. We have an obligation for the treaties that we signed. And part of that is to support Indigenous Canadians and their efforts to reclaim these languages. It is, we all need to contribute to this. I just can't say it strong enough. And the kind of expertise that you have is and just the way you can use your own experience to support the work of your Indigenous colleagues. I would ask you to do that. I've listed my references here. I've also listed some further readings, just tidbits. There's way more than that. And I want to thank you for your patience, and have a good semester.